$20 bill and a $1 bill met in a wallet. They had not seen each other since they were minted together. They decided to catch up on how life had been treating them. The $20 bill said, well, I got to tell you, I've been to Paris, I've been to London, I've been all around the world. I've been to the nicest, most beautiful hotels. I've been in the fanciest restaurants. He looked at the little $1 bill and said, and what about you, my friend? The $1 bill replied, oh, you know, just back and forth to church every week. I'm glad you can laugh. Because usually when we start talking about giving in the church, people get these looks on their face, you know. They get all uncomfortable. It should be the most joyful, exciting thing we do all year long. Be a part of a shared ministry with Jesus Christ. Imagine that. That's what we have. You saw in the video this morning the impact this congregation has just in one ministry area. Think of all the ministry areas. It's amazing and incredible what this congregation does. 2 years ago, we took our two oldest granddaughters on a journey. We went to Greece and Italy and Turkey. They thought they were going to see exotic places in the world, Europe, for the first time. Their grandmother and I thought we were taking them to follow the footsteps of St. Paul and enriching and encouraging their faith life. Somehow that seemed to involve shopping for the perfect purse in Italy, but I can't explain all that. We finally got to the Bema, which is in Corinth. This is where St. Paul preached, where these words were sent after he wrote them in Ephesus. He sent them here to Corinth. And that's Jordan and Kelsey, our two oldest granddaughters. Kelsey with the sunglasses, Jordan, her older sister, without the sunglasses. And so I got them to the Bema, right? To stand where St. Paul once stood, where these words were read aloud to a newborn church filled with first-time believers, spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ in a brave new world. And when it was all over, and we were standing around talking and looking at all the beauty that's there in Corinth and Greece, my youngest granddaughter, Kelsey, came up to me and she said, the words every preacher hates to hear. Papa, what did that mean? Right? What does that mean? Now, girls that age are interested in love, and she'd got that it was about love, but she couldn't really make the connection between those words of love and the church, which is an affliction that affects many Christians. In fact, at first she was a little disappointed as I explained to her that this chapter of the Bible, 1 Corinthians 13, that we know as the love chapter, was written in the middle of a stewardship campaign. It was your typical letter from the pastor that it's time to give again. Every pastor since then has wished we could write as eloquently as St. Paul did, but that's what it was. Now, the truth is, this is one of the most important letters written in the history of Christianity because of what was going on. See, the church had started in Jerusalem. And the concept was that first you became a Jew, and then sort of a super Jew, which they called Christians, followers of Christ. St. Paul had expanded that. He had gone out into the world, and he had met people who had no Jewish background. And they were becoming followers of Christ. And so the question was, were they really Christians? Since they weren't first Jews. And the debate raged through the church. In fact, Peter and Paul at one point were on completely opposite sides of that argument. And I wish this could be a lesson to all of our politicians today. They finally came back and found a way to work together. I wish Christians could learn that. I wish politicians could learn that. I even wish basketball teams could learn that. They found a way. They found common ground, and they recognized, loved, and blessed one another. And what the church came up with was this amazing concept of giving. Christians believed that was at the heart of being a follower of Christ. The heart of it, the foundation, the core of following Jesus was being a generous person, a person who could give sacrificially. You see, Christians, even to this day, believe this ridiculous and absurd concept. We believe that we can give away part of what we have, and that our God is so strong that he'll take care of us. Now, if you think about that according to the standards of the world, it is ridiculous and absurd. I mean, isn't the purpose of life to get all that you can get? To hold on to it, to grab it, to multiply your resources, to protect yourself and your family, to give yourself and your family as much security as possible? Isn't that what life is about? Christians fly in the face of that, and we say no. And a major part of life, and the core of our faith, is that we can give away part of what we have because we believe that God will take care of us. And in the same way that God takes care of us, we're called to take care of other people around us. It's the same ridiculous absurdity that permeates the idea of setting apart a day for worship. In the ancient world, people worked 7 days a week. Christians come along, building on the foundation of the Jewish folks before them, come along and they say, no, we can take one whole day a week that we don't have to work at all and focus on our spiritual life. Because our God is so generous and so good, our God can do in our lives in six days, provide what we need in 6 days, and we'll be okay. This concept that we can be generous and give and we can set aside part of our life for our spiritual growth is a way of thinking that focuses on what God does for us and leads us to lives of generosity. I want to try to answer this morning Kelsey's question. What does this have to do with anything? These words that St. Paul wrote. See, the plan that Paul came up with is that all these churches would take an offering. We still do the same thing in the Methodist Church today. We call it apportionment. It comes from this story in the Bible. That all these churches would share their offering. And that gift would be used to help poor Christians living in Jerusalem. It would test two things. First, were these folks who were becoming Christians outside of the Jewish faith, were they real Christians? And Paul said, if they give, they are. That's the test. And Peter agreed. And then secondly, would the church in Jerusalem accept the gift? Because if they did, it meant that they recognized these other churches and Christians as legitimate. And secondly, it would mean that the church in Jerusalem was admitting its own vulnerability and allowing God to minister to them through the gifts of others. And so that's the whole situation that Paul is speaking into as he writes this letter to the church in Corinth. He's saying it's time to rise up and to really be the followers of Christ, to be generous and giving, to share what you have with those who are in need, because that is the core of what it means to be Christian. And he does this very interesting thing. He doesn't say to them, do it because it is your responsibility. It's a good word, a word I believe in, but that's not the appeal he makes. He doesn't say it's your responsibility. He doesn't say it's a have to or a must. Not in that way. He doesn't say it's your duty. He says, do it if you love. Because for St. Paul, love was more than just something you say. Love is a verb. Love is the way you do life. And I sat there on that morning in Corinth with my granddaughters and explained what St. Paul believed about love. That love is something you feel in your heart, but that you can't help but act on in your life. And the way that you live out love is by being generous and sharing what you have with others, always in the faith that God is working through that way of generous living to bless the people around you and to lift and grow you in your faith, and hear this carefully, in your capacity to love. You see, we have a capacity to love, and it's limited only by our selfishness. If we don't share, if we don't live and give generously, that capacity for love gets smaller and smaller and smaller, can even be snuffed out. And I can tell you, to my 13-year-old granddaughter, that made a lot of sense. At the same time, as we grow in our generosity, that capacity of love increases and increases and increases and grows. Now, I wanted to say something to my granddaughters that I thought they might remember, so I didn't ask them to memorize the whole chapter. They would have smiled and nodded and said, "Sure, Papa," and then never done it, most likely. I asked them instead to just focus on one verse and on the 4 verbs in that verse. Verse 7, it bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures. Bears, believes, hopes, and endures. Bears, believes, hopes, and endures. Now, bears and endures are very romantic words, aren't they? I can imagine when I was dating my wife, if I said to her, "Honey, let's get married so you can bear and endure me." How successful that proposal would have been, right? Although, to be honest, if we were completely open when we were getting married, that is the sort of way we should propose. To bear and endure. It's not really about creating a burden. It's about sharing a burden. It's about the sharing of life. You see, because that's what love really is. It's sharing life. It's sharing the good days, the bad days, the smiles, and the tears. That's what bearing and enduring means. That's what the apostle was saying. You can't just give lip service to love. You have to do it. You have to be there in the dirt of it. You have to be there when someone's in the hospital. You have to be there when someone is dying. You have to be there with the one you know who's close to you, who's going through a divorce, or who hears from the doctor a prognosis that's terrible. Love is about living life together. 155 years ago, Methodists went to one of the most violent and impoverished places in the world. It's still considered the second most impoverished place in the world, right behind Soweto in South Africa, and that is north central Kenya. 155 years ago, Methodists went there to share Jesus Christ and to bring healing, physical healing, to the people of that area. They took over an old British dressing station, an old military hospital, and that hospital has been serving as a center of ministry in that community ever since. There we serve a population of over 1 million people. 30 years ago, we did the most audacious, crazy thing ever in Oklahoma. One of our bishops had been in Africa, and he'd made one of those speeches bishops make. This is Prudy in the terminal ward. These people are all dying. He did one of those things bishops do. He said, "We have a great Methodist college in Oklahoma. We'd love for some of you to go to school there." 3 months later, a young African man showed up at the Oklahoma City airport with everything he owned in the world in his suitcase, called the bishop and said, "Remember when you invited us to come to college? Here I am." He called me up and he said, I was just a young pastor out of seminary, and he called me up and he said, "Robert, I want you to be in charge of our African mission. And I said, Bishop, I didn't know we have an African mission. He said, yes, we do, and it's at the airport waiting for you to pick it up. Absolutely true story. So we got together with some folks and we put together a committee, because that's what you do in the Methodist Church. Nothing is really consecrated, sanctified, and made holy till it has a committee behind it. It was a young single mom on that committee that eventually I would ask to marry me. We got to know each other in that ministry. That young student's name was Stanley Amunya, and he will be here in our church Wednesday night at 6:30 to tell you his story and the story of the ministry in Maua, Kenya. The Oklahoma Conference bravely, Methodists in Oklahoma bravely stepped out, and we said we will bring Africans over here from their villages, most of whom have never driven a car, never ridden in a car, never been in a plane, and we will train them and educate them and send them back to Maua to lead the ministry there. And those young African students came to Oklahoma, and we trained them and educated. And if you were giving to the church 30 years ago, putting your money in the offering plate, you paid for their education and their training. And for the last 30 years, they've been serving the poorest, some of the most poor and impoverished people in the world. And they have literally converted tens of thousands of people. They have performed tens of thousands of medical operations, and they have cared for hundreds of thousands of people and continue to care for over 10,000 AIDS orphans in that ministry that you paid for. You see, because love is about bearing and enduring. And we said to our African brothers and sisters, if this is what you're bearing and enduring, then it will be what we bear and what we endure with you. Because that's what love really is. The bearing and the enduring of life. Today, the hope that is in Africa is so great that they're sending missionaries to us. As I said in the beam of that morning in Corinth, I said, think about another of those verbs. Love believes all things. Now that's silly, isn't it? Why would Paul write that? Love believes all things. You notice he didn't put a qualifier in there. Not in the Greek that he originally wrote in. Not in the English translation that we have. It doesn't say love believes some things. It doesn't even say love believes these things. It says love believes all things. Now the only people I know that really believe all things are children. Children believe in the potential and the possibility of life until we train them to believe otherwise. And Paul called us back and calls us today back to a ministry of believing all things. It means doing ministry with and for children and youth. It means saying to every child that comes into this church for Logos, every child that comes into this church on Sunday morning, every church that we minister to at Lincoln Elementary, every child that walks in and out of this building during the week, that we confirm in them that they can believe in everything, every possibility and every potentiality of their life, because they are precious and Christ loves them. To do anything less is to fail as a church. To do anything less is to fail as followers of Jesus Christ. I thank God for a church where children and youth are a priority and not an afterthought or inconvenience. We have to claim for that generation their right to believe. And we do that by loving them, accepting them, affirming them, and sharing with them that we believe. There's one other thing the apostle says in that simple little verse. Love hopes all things. You know, if a person has hope, they can face anything. Over the years as a pastor, I've made hundreds, maybe thousands of hospital calls. I've been with people in mental hospitals. I've been with people in counseling. And the one thing that I recognize over and over again is if there is hope, people can do anything. A person may hear that they're diagnosed with cancer, but if they have hope, they can endure it and overcome it. A person may go through a terrible divorce, but if they can find a place in their life where there is hope, they can overcome it. A person may lose the most precious person in their life, but if they can find hope, they can overcome it. We are in the hope business. That is what we do in this church. It is our calling. It is our work. It is the focus of everything we say and do. To share hope. We who have experienced Jesus Christ in our life are called to share Christ with those around us in a way that reveals to them there is hope. And I will tell you, there is no more loving act, no more loving act in any relationship that you are involved in than sharing hope with someone. That's what being a Christian is about. That's why we give. That's why we sign a pledge card. A pledge card is not a contract. It's not a law. It's not a rule. It's a goal. It's a way of saying, this is what I want to do next year to serve the ministry of Jesus Christ. You can change it anytime you need to. It's a way of saying that I want to make the work of Jesus Christ first in my life. It's a way I want to share hope. And it's an amazing thing. When you share hope with somebody, you're going to find hope growing in your own life. You cannot share hope with someone else without becoming more hopeful yourself. I'm so proud of the 2 seminary students we have from our church. Courtney is in seminary in Dallas. She wants to be an Army chaplain because when she was a kid and her dad had to deploy, there was an Army chaplain there for her. She's living out her life in gratitude. She wants to return to other children and military families what her family received. And many of you, of course, know Andrea Dollarhide, who's on our staff here. Andrea's in seminary to prepare herself to do education and administrative work in the church, living out her calling to serve Jesus Christ. I'm so proud that this is the kind of church where young people, because of their experience in ministry in this congregation, say, I want to give my entire life to serving Jesus Christ. It reminds me of when I was in seminary. I was very blessed to go to SMU. It was totally out of the blue for me. I never planned on that. I didn't grow up thinking I was going to go to seminary. I was literally in church one Sunday night, kneeling at the altar at the prayer time at the end of a sermon that wasn't particularly good as I remember it. There are those that happen. And I suddenly felt something in my heart saying that I was called to go and become a pastor. It was the most uncomfortable feeling I think I've ever had. I was going to seminary. I was working 2 jobs to try to get through graduate school. And I got to that last year of seminary, and I was just out of money. I was out of energy, and I was out of everything. So I went to the associate dean, a guy named Jim Ward, who was from Oklahoma, because I thought I could buddy up to him because he was from Oklahoma. And I went and told him, I said, look, I'm going to have to drop out of school. He said, it's your senior year. I said, I know, but I'm broke. I just don't have any money. I'm worn out working 2 jobs. I'm going to have to drop out of school for a few years, try to save some money, and come back to graduate. He said, you do feel called? I said, yes, sir. I feel called to be a pastor. And I shared with him the story of my calling. He said, I see. I walked out of his office. Later that day, I was in class. And the dean came and knocked on the window of the class, and he pointed at me and went like this. Something you never want to see the dean do, right? Right? And my life flashed before me, and I remembered that I had been in the assistant dean's office, and I thought it would really be funny to change the class schedule around a little bit. So I had put some things in the class schedule, like a class on all-you-can-eat communion, a class on nude baptism. And I had not paid a lot of attention to what I did. I thought he would see that was funny. He would think it was funny. Instead, he had his secretary print it and put it in everybody's box. So I thought, well, I'm being called in for what I did. My prank has caught up with me. And they took me down. I went down to an empty classroom, and I walked in there, and there was my New Testament professor, my Old Testament professor, and my church history professor. And the dean said to me, he said, "Do you think you have to drop out?" And I said, "Yes, sir, we've talked about that. I can't afford to go anymore." And he said, "Are you called to be a pastor in the Methodist Church?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, Are you called to go back and serve in Oklahoma?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And those 4 men wrote a check each to cover the rest of my education. They also had a check from a family in Tulsa that I have never met, who gave a gift to help pay for my tuition for my senior year. That kind of a gift is completely transforming. And I can remember even to this day the feeling of being in that room with those 4 men who I admired so much, and feeling like I was experiencing the presence of Christ in a way I never had before. See, when you share love with someone, it means you share hope. When you share believing with someone, it means you share love. And when you bear and endure and live life with someone, it means you love them. And that's all a pledge card is. It's a love letter to God and the people around you. And this is the word of God in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen.